Okay, welcome back. And if you would just do as we've done before, just pause looking at that screen and get the quote taken down. All right, so we're moving on. Act 1, Scene 3. I'm going to try and keep this under 5 minutes. Let's see how I get on. Keep it nice and short for you. Act 1, Scene 3 is hugely important for a number of reasons. One, it's the first scene we actually meet Macbeth in. We feel like we've already known him. The witches refer to him. The captain describes him. Now in Act 1, Scene 3, we meet him along with his comrade and good friend, at least we assume, at the start of the play, Banquo. Now, the witches create an atmosphere of chaos and destruction again. This time, one of the witches is describing how essentially she's putting a curse on a sailor. She's creating chaos and destruction. She is changing the weather to try and disrupt his life, and all because of the witch and his wife had some sort of confrontation. What this shows us is the witches like to play around and like to control, and essentially they act like puppet masters of sorts, creating destruction through the weather and through the chaos of the atmosphere on Earth. Hugely important, because we know that that's what they can do with Macbeth. How does Shakespeare then bring that to life? Well, the first thing is he uses interesting language to make a connection between Macbeth and the witches. So we can ask ourselves, is Macbeth completely innocent? Well, I don't think Shakespeare wants us to think that. The first words that Macbeth speaks are the same words as the witches. Why? Maybe the witches are in his head, controlling his thoughts. Maybe he is already in that world of evil, and maybe that gives us scope to think about Macbeth as being an inherently evil person already, and the witches just bring it to life. That's possible. Either way, what he says is that, so foul and fair a day I have not seen. What he's doing is echoing the words of the witches in Act 1, Scene 1. Fair is foul and foul is fair. So he uses the exact same words. What he's talking about here is that essentially the weather is bad. We assume from the description, the weather is bad, but of course it's fair because they've had a great victory. Now, the other side is foul. There was a lot of killing. Maybe Macbeth is referring to that as well. You can't be 100% sure. But either way, Macbeth uses the same words as the witches. I really like that connection that Shakespeare makes between Macbeth and the witches. So foul and fair a day I have not seen. The witches arrive, and the witches are described. I'm not going into the detail of them. Actually, they're very well documented on the internet and anywhere else, so you can find all that out. What I'm looking at is the different reactions that Macbeth has and Banquo has. So they're two different reactions. Banquo is somewhat skeptical. Now, that word skeptical is very important. It shows us that he's unsure, and he doesn't trust them. Because look at what he says. When the witches come, when the witches give the prophecies to both Macbeth and Banquo, they say to Macbeth that he will be or is Thane of Glamis, that he will be Thane of Cawdor, which hasn't happened yet, and that he shall be king hereafter. Banquo, on the other hand, gets a different set of prophecies. Not that he will be king, but that he will get kings. Essentially, he will have sons who go on to become kings. Macbeth is intrigued, but Banquo is skeptical and unsure. He wonders, should they listen to these witches? Should they trust what they have to say? Because Banquo says, oftentimes to win us to our harm, so to bring harm, to bring destruction, the witches sometimes create situations and tell us truths only to betray us. So oftentimes to win us to our harm, to win us to our harm, and essentially to bring harm and destruction, it's being described almost as a challenge. These witches enjoy causing mischief and enjoy causing this sense of disruption. Banquo uses a very interesting metaphor, and when I do this, just remember, there's a quote, a nice little quote to use. Banquo is skeptical and refers to the witches as instruments of darkness. If you think of that, that's a quote straight away. You don't even have to remember all this. You can just refer to that and then use this in your own words. So the instruments of darkness that Banquo describes are the witches. Okay, so we'll put that down there. They are the witches. These witches are instruments of darkness, and darkness we associate with evil. We associate with the devil. And to put a bit of context on this, James I wrote a book on demonology. James I was fascinated by this idea of the devil and by this idea of witches. He was responsible himself for lots of witch hunts. So this play, The Witches, all designed to bring in the interest of King James I at the time. So the instruments of darkness, he says, tell us truths only to betray us. So essentially, to trick us, to trick, to fool, and essentially to cheat. I'll give you a good keyword again, especially for those looking at those higher grades. Very important, and definitely look into this a bit more. What the witches use in their trickery, in their language, is called equivocation. Okay, equivocation is ambiguous speech, unclear speech. And I know some of these words can be a bit challenging at times, but it's about trying to embrace it. If you understand the basics first and then move to the next level of these higher level terms and subject terminology. Okay, so I think that sums it up. We've got Banquo's side, where he is skeptical and unsure of the witches. He believes that the witches are trying to bring harm. He's much more unsure than Macbeth. He calls them the instruments of darkness. Now, I didn't go into the details of instruments, but essentially they are being played by the devil. Okay, so they are essentially like the tools of the devil. So we put that in there. The devil plays them, essentially showing us that all of this evil and darkness comes directly from the devil, and that the witches are his agents, that the witches are his soldiers that spread his evil, essentially. Okay, and that should give us enough, and I've kept close to 5 minutes at least. Hopefully you'll find that helpful. We'll look at Macbeth next.